Hi there, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, here with Father Shannon Bouquet, our president.
Tad, once again, good to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely, Father. I always say that, absolutely, Father, and it's true. So today we're doing something a little different. We're not going to be discussing any of your articles, but we're just going to be discussing in general the issue of contraception with a specific eye towards talking about it with basically evangelizing fellow Christians who might not be opposed to contraception. And if that, if it goes well, we may end up, doing further in the series about talking to, non-Christian religious people, non-religious people, etc. But for now, we're just going to focus on essentially Protestants, right? Because maybe this is a good place to start off. We can say that Catholics and Orthodox are, at least in theory, agreed upon this issue that contraception is not permissible, right, Father?
Well, the teaching of the Church on this regard, let's kind of step back a little bit.
Sure.
And look at it, up until, let's go back to the Lambeth Council in 1930. I think this is kind of a good starting point to kind of kick off this conversation. Up until that period, 1930, the dominantly the Christian Church, which meant the Catholic and the Christian community as a whole, held in a unified manner that contraception was something immoral, and that it was not something that was good for marriage. It was not good, for couples to practice, and it was something that was held pretty much across the board up until that period. And then all of a sudden what we've seen is the Catholic Church today being primarily the only, Christian church, Catholic faith, that is holding this line that goes back to ancient times, goes back, to the very teaching of the church and our Judaic root as well. So we have maintained, we have been faithful to that teaching, and we have advanced that teaching still to this day, because it was the truth yesterday, it's the truth today, and it will be the truth tomorrow. And I think it's important, that when people don't look at the history and they don't look back at, at the origins of changes in position, that it gives the impression that, well, this is how it's always been. It's only the Catholic Church that's holding on to ancient things, but in reality, if people really peeled back their own history and would realize within the Christian fold that the Christian Church held this together. And that's the problem today, is that some have broken with that truth. They have now advanced something false, something that is completely opposed to what we held from our Judaic root, and throughout this period of time until 1930. And the consequences of that act, which really began, as we've seen, as we've had conversations before, Tad, where the exception, basically that's how it began, was in rare circumstances, in certain situations, but we know what happens there. The moment you open that door, the moment you give any rationale for any exception to the truth or to that rule, then it just opens the door to everything else.
Right, and we can mention, you mentioned the Lambeth Conference in 1930, that would be the Anglican Church deciding that, as you said, it's the limited circumstances between, and they said between married couples, and then
Correct.
Of course in society that becomes no limitations on the circumstance, and then not even marriage, it's just whenever, right, over the course of the decades. Yeah, and that's where we are now.
Right. But I think as a Catholic, teaching, it's a very rich teaching because it's rooted in the dignity of the human person, which is would be our starting point. But just to look at how does the church look at the moral life? How does the church recognize what is the moral life? And why is she advancing the moral life? So let's kind of start there, and then we kind of move our way through and talk a little bit more about this. So when we have an understanding of what the church means by moral life, so it means living in accord with the good and the well-being of the human person and the image of the human person, that we are made in the likeness and image of God. So when we start with an understanding of where that moral life finds its root, to advance a good, to want the good of another human being, and ultimately to be in communion with the good, and the ultimate good is to be in union with God. And so the moral life is moving us in that direction. So I want the good for myself, I want the good for you, and then I want the good for others, And ultimately, I want to experience the supreme good, which is God, to be in union with God. And with that, we move then forward. And so for the Catholic faith, we start with an understanding of the human person. So this is when we understand the intrinsic and absolute value of the human person. Then we can move that conversation to explain why good actions, why good habits build virtuous way of living, and why that good becomes something that guides my choices, guides how I deal with situations, particularly in marriage. So it's not something that just affects individuals or affects married people. It affects all of us. And so this absolute value, this intrinsic value that of each one of us, and it's not something bestowed upon us by anyone else. It's not bestowed by government. It's not based on race or religious practice. It's based in the very simple fact that we are the only creature made in the image and likeness of God, and that's the starting point of that conversation. And then the moral life flows from that understanding. And all of Catholic teaching really starts in the understanding of the human person, because it is that good, that absolute value of the human person that begins all of our conversation. As a matter of fact, when we talk about our whole social doctrine of the church, it's the first principle. It's human goodness. It's the goodness of the human person. And then everything moves from there. And so whether I'm dealing with issues of health, whether I'm dealing with issues of work, or whether I'm dealing with, the whole option for the poor, the whole gambit of social doctrine starts with that first and fundamental principle. And when we don't understand it, when we don't understand that first principle, then we can see how the falsification begins to happen. And we begin to falsify the goods. And so, which brings us to what we're talking about, because when we start with the human person and we understand the human person, and then we realize, that the human person is not, a body and a soul in a sense of two separate, entities. It's very important, in some of our teaching and writings, we talk about this, that go back to Aristotle, who understood, that, substantially, the human person is a body and a soul. It's essential, united. It's not two separate. It's not like I put on my body like I put on a coat, because it's cold outside. And why is that important? Because what we see in our current culture, and again, this has plagued humanity, from the time of Aristotle. Because
it was Plato's idea that the soul and the body were distinct entities residing. Right. The soul was within the body. Right.
And so when you misunderstand it, then you can see what happens, how contraception becomes something accepted, because it really is a violation. It violates the good of the person. It violates the good of a nature of the human person. It violates the good of marriage, and it distorts the conjugal act. And so, but again, we have to understand each of those points in order to really expose why it's something that the church still holds, that this is an intrinsic evil. It is completely opposed to the good of the human person. It's opposed to the good of marriage, and it violates other goods. And that's part of the conversation. And so that's why language is important. So when we have conferences and we're meeting with people both who are Catholic, non-Catholic, Christian, non-Christian, it's really talking about terminology and really kind of breaking through what people think. And and really people think that the church is just antiquated. It's just it just wants to live in the old times, and just it's kind of a moral way of holding people to some kind of rigid rule. But when you really pierce through it and you break down what the church teaches, people really come to appreciate, and they come to really acknowledge that there's something good here that the church is advancing. So it's not a question of no's; it's a question of good. Something beautiful, something really wonderful being advanced. So I think that's always a good starting point.
Okay, yeah, and definitely so we don't have to go through citations or anything, but we can talk about how this, the church fathers spoke on, obviously the reason why this is such a big issue now is because the technology of modern contraception didn't start until about 100 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. But contraception in various forms have been around for forever. And actually, it was interesting you mentioned our continuing our Judaic roots, because actually the sin of onanism is in the Bible. It's not really contraception, but it's the same mentality, and God killed him on the spot for that sin. So it's clear, and even in the Old Testament, that this is, the principles at play are perennial throughout history of salvation. So, we don't have to go through all those church father citations or anything, but maybe we can talk about how, I guess the most recent expression of that same teaching was in St. Paul VI's landmark document, Humanae Vitae, which just reaffirmed perennial teaching. Actually was kind of, in that sense, not very significant as far as doctrine was concerned, because there was no development of doctrine or anything.
Right.
But just describe that document and then describe the reaction, the very unfortunate reaction from the world and from Catholics to that.
Well, kind of setting, Humanae Vitae, on human life, and into the context of the times. And you already gave a little bit of that, Tad. And, when you have a society that, is one. So let's kind of start with a good. We've talked about this before in our podcast, and I've written about it many times, is there are people within scientific community, within the healthcare community. There are obviously majority of the time, and I'm going to kind of give a broad approach, is that it's a good that they're trying to look at. In other words, so when people do research, they're trying to serve a good. They're trying to have a dilemma, and they're trying to find a way to resolve it. And what we see within this period of time is not that people were looking for a way to advance, quote, the contraceptive issue. They came across this, in a whole process of and realized this particular medication, this particular drug, this particular had this side effect to it, or had this.
You're talking about the contraceptive
pill, right? Mm-hmm. So when you consider, and then they realize, wow, well, maybe we can use it for this. So what happens is that when you start with looking for research, you're looking for a way to promote human health. And, you come to a point where you realize, okay, we can do this. The question really has to become, should we do it now? Is this something that really is good? Is it something that will advance the good? And this is what was going on in this period, plus the whole consequence of a sexual revolution, the rejection of authority. It
was occurring about the same time.
Exactly. And so you have all these things occurring, kind of coming to the top of the cup. And then you had people, wanting the church to change her teaching, to reject, what it understood about this act. And so we've got to remember that we're talking about a particular act here. It's a conjugal act. It's an act between a husband and a wife, and only an act that should be occurring between a husband and a wife. That's the first thing that we have to really focus on here. And when we realize that many, that want to change that act, to redefine it, to determine that it can be something other than what its nature is meant to be, and that is the good of husband and wife, in the sense of this unity of husband and wife, the oneness of each other, and always this openness to human life, the transmission of human life, that this act is always to be open to the gift of life, never to impede it, never to intend to impede it, or to do anything to cause it not to occur. And so this is something very important. And so what happens is that what Paul VI was dealing with is that there were people, even within church commission that was created, to look into this area, to talk about it. Really, some of them were making recommendations that we'd accept, very much like the Lambeth, decision in 1930 we talked about earlier, that it would be limited, it would have an exception. Well, but Paul VI, did something that was truly so important, and he said it in Humanae Vitae. He did not have the authority to change the teaching. He didn't have the ability to do anything other than to advance what the church has always taught. And that is to promote the good that is marriage, the nature of marriage, and the nature of the conjugal act, and the beauty of human life, the transmission of human life. So he really did something that people were just not ready to hear. They did not want to hear that.
And I think in the history of that commission, there was the majority report and the minority report, and the majority report was in favor of these, what you're talking about. Right. I believe this is the case, I'm not sure, of having some kind of restricted allowance for contraception. Right. He just said, no, we're sticking with what the magisterial teaching is.
Well, and with that, it's and we don't want to really downplay in a sense, and I know we're not, but in the sense of the courageous decision that Paul did, but more than that, it's that he couldn't do.
Right.
And I think that's important to understand, is that it's not something that the church can just randomly, arbitrarily decide.
I said sticking with, but it's not that he was sticking with like as a decision. It was that he was confirming that he is the magisterial decider, and it has to be the same.
And we would see in Familiaris Consortio, John Paul himself, in an exhortation, would pick it up, and really advance the teaching of Humanae Vitae. And, in our mission work at HLI, it's one of our primary documents, Humanae Vitae. It's a small, beautiful magisterial document, an encyclical that really summarizes, if you will, the heart of the Church's teaching on marriage and on the conjugal act and the transmission of human life. And what's so sad is in the mission field, and like we see in our own country here, Tad, and many people, they might know the name of the document, they may have heard it, and they just completely reject it. But very few people have ever read it. They've heard commentaries, they've heard people in articles, but very few people who are really quote unquote against that document. If you were to ask, most have never opened the document at all. They don't even know what it says. And so when you say, well, tell me, what are you against in this? Tell me what it is that you're opposed to, and ultimately it just comes down to the fact they just don't agree with the Church's teaching on the issue of contraception. But then when you push the conversation and say, well, tell me why. What is it about that teaching that, quote, is offensive, that you find that it doesn't respect your dignity? And then that's where the conversation really begins to unpack itself, because that is where the door opens to talk about the nature, of the human person, and to understand the dignity of the human person and why an act of contraception is a violation of that dignity. But until we are able to talk about those fundamentals, it really is hard. People just take it as a no. They just take it as something that's imposed upon couples, and it causes a burden upon couples. And then you hear the whole idea that they can't afford to have more children, and they think the Church just teaches that
Right, and this idea of that it's a no is actually based on kind of a sense of entitlement in the first place, which developed pretty quickly, given that for a long time contraception in the way that it is now was not available so readily or even legally, right?
Correct.
So
that's right, exactly. And I think most of our audience would be surprised, that at one time, in our own country, contraception was illegal. In the sense of, so when people think about how these mindsets have changed, over time, and what we accept today as just normal, in a sense of behavior or choices, was not so the mindset just decades ago. And that there was this clear understanding, of the fact that, only married couples is where, in our mindset, which still is a teaching of the Church, whereas the only place where a sexual act occurred is between a husband and a wife. But today that would be a foreign, understanding because in our culture that is so readily accepted promiscuity, they've accepted cohabitation, they've accepted, sexual activity as something normative. So what's important, and I think what we're doing, Tad, is we're trying to peel back and trying to return, to, not something in a sense of just because it's something of old teaching, but to explain that teaching as it has been and is and will be, and it helps to promote that good. And I think that's the real challenge today, is trying to get to the language, because, as we've done in other times when we talk about marriage, well, today marriage can be defined in many ways by different people. But when you and I speak about marriage, when the Church speaks about marriage, we're talking about the union of one man and one woman in an exclusive, indissoluble, fruitful union. All right? That's what we mean by marriage. So, but that's not the narrative in our culture. And when we speak that the sexual act, what we would call the conjugal act, all right, the conjugal love between husband and wife, what we're speaking about here is not just some biological activity, all right, but in a way the world sees it very differently. It sees it as something, like you mentioned, an entitlement, but basically it's just what people do. It's how people, respond to gratifications and seek for happiness. But ultimately what we're talking about is something much deeper than that. And it's a true happiness. It's a true respect for human persons. And it's a wanting the good of the other being and an understanding of what it means of giving of myself to another human being, in that exclusive relationship. And how that particular act is also an act of generosity that is open always, to life. Well, again, when we don't understand those components, then what I'm talking about is, I might as well be talking about something from Mars or from Jupiter, but I'm not. I'm actually speaking of something that was understood for centuries, and maybe not as eloquently, as we see in the Catechism written, but people had an understanding that, that this. You married because you wanted to spend your life with this person. You married because you wanted to have children, and you wanted to be a family, and you wanted to enjoy one day your children's children. And just the beauty of that family life. And today we see a mockery of family on TV. We see a mockery of marriage. We see, the sadness of the consequences of legalized divorce. We see a culture here, especially in the West, where, cohabitation is just accepted today. And again, we see basically an understanding of sexual acts as something just normative between people, whether they be of same sex or opposite sex.
And even the idea of the sexual act, we have a very particular, only the natural intercourse between a man and a woman that is capable of generating life.
Correct.
Counts under that heading, whereas sexual activity is all kinds of things to modern ears.
And let's be honest, the whole pornography industry has also changed how people approach the subject as well.
Absolutely.
So, but these are all the things that we need to be addressing as we talk about this particular subject of which Humanae Vitae, began to talk about. And that was it rejected what the secular culture wanted. It denied what some, even within the church, were trying to advance. And what Paul VI did was repeat and reaffirm. I think that's a good language. He reaffirmed what the church has consistently taught and will continue to consistently teach. And as I mentioned, this is what John Paul picked up in Familiaris Consortio and many other documents since, Evangelium Vitae, picked up, and just keeps advancing and moves forward. And so, which the Catechism of the Catholic Church eloquently speaks about. And we're going to see that long after you and myself are passed from this world, that teaching will continue to move forward because it is the truth. And truth is truth. It doesn't just become arbitrarily a change because someone wants it to change or tries to redefine it and give it a new name.
Yeah, it's interesting in that sense that there was even a commission at all, but maybe to have the right way to elucidate the doctrine was
right.
Perhaps the purpose.
And sometimes these committees or councils are formed. What you just said, for example, today, if we were having a conversation on embryonic stem cell research, or we would want to be able to try to understand all of the complexity of that before we put something in writing, is how do we address it? What is it? And, so and the church has always been very good at that, knowing what she speaks about, knowing what it is that she's addressing, and then what's the moral response? What's the ethical response to that? So it's something that, was happening then with Paul VI, and it's still something happening today.
Yeah. And it makes one proud to be, or it kind of is in the context that we're talking about. I want to shift into the questions of addressing this with other Christians and Protestants. But it makes one proud to be part of the church, the Catholic Church, that still maintains this teaching, Christian teaching, in such a coherent and strong way. Being fair then to the churches that have maintained their position, there are a few Protestant churches, and like we said, the Orthodox churches have maintained this, apostolic teaching. Many Protestant denominations have not. Right. And so I wanted to first talk about why perhaps they've gone the way of the world, and then now how big that rift is before we start to talk about how we can, work on evangelizing.
Sure. My experience, at least what I've experienced in the mission field, and also having been a priest now almost 30 years, it's so talking with people who are not of Catholic faith, So let's make sure we kind of distinguish the group right now, because we have problems, obviously, within the Catholic faith, where sadly, many of our Catholic people are not practicing, the Church's teaching in this regard.
And that's a whole other issue.
Very different issue. But there are similarities in the sense, both occasions, as I brought up earlier, it's really a misunderstanding. There's not a clear understanding of the essential good that is being promoted and being advanced. And so, because the Church looks at, in very different ways, looks at this beautiful life that we call marriage and looks at the ends of marriage in a very unique way in the sense of what we talk about in the unitive and the procreative ends. And so the Church has a way of addressing and talking about this that is not in normal conversation, in parlance, if you will, of people just every day sitting around a table having a conversation about marriage. That's not what they really are talking about. Though they mention aspects of it. They talk about unity. They talk about, being one. They'll talk about, being exclusive. I've been married 65 years. I've been married 50 years or 40 years. And so people are talking about those ends in a way. And really promoting it. And today, again, sadly, because of divorce, and we see a misunderstanding of marriage and fidelity and exclusivity, we see where there is a wound. And so many of our listeners, for example, could be coming from wounded families, broken families. So it's become so much a common thing today that, when you hear someone that's been married 40 years, man, how did you make that happen? But people are talking about it. And that's where we can come into the conversation, is to kind of do what our Lord Jesus talks about. Let's return to the way it was in the beginning. So again, he's not looking at something at historical for the sake of a historical fact. He's just saying, this is not what God created. This is not how God created man and woman. This is not why God made them complementary, why he made them for each other. And what does that relationship really reflect? Who does it reflect? And what is the purpose of marriage? What are the ends of marriage? And so people, just kind of talk about, till death do us part. Okay, that's a good way to talk a little bit about it, but let's talk about what's in between those parts. So what happens from the moment that you make this commitment to each other and you promise to be with each other until death do you part, until that moment comes when you pass from this world. And so what is all this in between about, and how does it reflect what you said on the day that you were married, in your vows and your commitment to each other, and what is this end about? And I think what people because life happens. And that's where we see the difficulties, because they're faced with decision making. They're facing, how do we raise a family? How many children do we want to be open to? So they kind of start thinking from a very secular point. And then when you have a secular narrative pushing down, especially today, and let's be honest, all the way back to Paul VI, you had this whole idea of overpopulation. You had the issue about what can we feed everybody? How can we sustain?
Well, even before that, Margaret Sanger started
when
the 30s, I think.
Yes.
So
this has been around a while. So today you would still hear it. I mean, if a married couple went into the grocery store today, I know this for a fact because I hear people with larger families, they go into the grocery store, and sometimes you hear people make fun of them. All this is affecting how people approach this. So for us, and what I've done is just listen to what people think. Just talk about it. So tell me, what do you think marriage is? What is the purpose of marriage? Why did God create this wonderful sacred institution? Because it's a God-given institution. It's very biblical. That's a starting point. God created it. He made man for woman and woman for man. And this exclusive, indissoluble, fruitful union, God created it. So with that, that's a starting point. And for people who share our Christian root, that is a good starting point, because that's where it should start. It should start, what does Scripture teach us about this sacred institution? And I'm being very purposeful in saying sacred, because it is. It's a sacred institution. And as we also know from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we know that family life, is built on the foundation of marriage. So if marriage is as it is intended to be, then our families grow from that reality. And that's where society shares. That's why John Paul said society passes through the family. So that's why this is an important conversation, because if we're going to heal the wounds of our culture, then we need to get to the fundamental cell that helps bring about that healing. So that's where I usually like to try to start. And oftentimes what I find is what happens, there comes a moment when there is a decision to be made. And that is, we probably, in almost every time I've had this level of conversation.
And you're talking specifically with
non-Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Non-Catholic Christians.
They actually agree. Mm-hmm. And I haven't talked about contraception yet. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the good of marriage, the biblical understanding of marriage. What does God intend for marriage based on sacred scripture, based on Christian teaching that has gone through the centuries, our Judeo-Christian understanding of marriage. Most of the time, there's no disagreement until we come to the part now. Let's talk about, the beauty of the conjugal act. And what's happened is this is where we've seen the narrative of the secular world and also personal narratives begin to take over. And all of a sudden, the purpose of marriage, the beauty that marriage is, of this lifetime relationship and this complementary journey with each other to our heavenly glory, all right, somehow gets caught up in the day to day, and that's where the conversation changes, because now all of a sudden we want to treat the conjugal act as something different than what it is, and what its nature is, and what its purpose is, and how it is to be lived and expressed and celebrated. And so we want to dissect it from the nature of the human person. And the very fact that when we introduce contraception into this conjugal moment, we've now changed the act. We've made it that which it is not. And that's a radical change. And that's the real challenge, to try to get someone to see that you've taken this act between a husband and wife, a most intimate act, an act that is supposed to express a unitive dimension. So giving of myself, if I were married, my spouse giving herself to me, and together just being open to the expression of that unitive act, which is the possibility of a child to be conceived, to be welcomed as a fruit of that unitive act. And so all of a sudden, when you introduce a contraceptive mentality, don't want to be pregnant, all right, don't want to have a child, and then I employ a method, whatever that method may be, that into that act, I've now changed that act. I've radically altered it. I've made it something that it is not. And that's where the real crux of the conversation begins. And that's a challenge a lot of times, not just with our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, with our own Catholic fold. And so what's happened is we have to really stop there. That's what has to really begin the conversation, is, now what does that mean? And that's what they'll ask. I don't understand that, because, I still love my wife, I still love my husband. I said, I didn't question the issue of your emotion and your feeling, but the idea is that, that the sincerity that you may have, that's a good. But now you've introduced something that is opposed to that good.
Yeah, I think St. John Paul II called it a lie. There's a falsification of the act. It doesn't matter what you think.
Exactly.
It's, we can talk about various kinds of examples, but just what your intention is what matters, in addition to the nature of the matter and form.
Right. And the choice that you've made. It's the object you've chosen. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we have intent, and the fact of carrying it out. And so I think that, that's what I mean by when we're talking about, no matter how we try to redefine it, to give it a new definition, it doesn't change it. It doesn't change its nature. And contraception is a very particular act. It's contra. I'm against conception. So the whole understanding is I'm against. See, it's interesting. The church is for, all right, and those who are for contraception are actually against something. So they accuse us of being against something. We're not. We're actually for. We're for the very good that marriage is, and we're very much for the good of what the conjugal love and fruit of that love is.
That's right. Yeah, Fulton Sheen once said he was giving a talk on this subject, and he said, the term birth control is what many people use, but he said we're never going to use that term because its promoters are not interested in either birth or control,
Right,
meaning
that's right.
self-control. Right. So.
And that's a good way, Tad, to segue into that, because when you look at one of the prophecies of Paul VI, which, again, is very important. So Paul VI talked about that if this mindset begins to take root and is allowed to advance itself, we will see the objectification of women. So we already see this very clearly, right? Done. We see this in our culture today where not just women, obviously we can look at how the objectification of men, so we can see both sides being objectified, looking at basically as an object to be used for gratification. And then the second thing, obviously, is it's going to lead, to the breakdown of marriage. It's going to cause. And when you look at the very reasons why we see marriage faltering today is because, again, we've falsified marriage. We've made it into something that it is not. And so the idea of, like Bishop Sheen, the idea here when you have no way of discipline and basically you can have this relationship anytime you want in the sense of
because that's really what contraception provides.
Of course.
And that's not the reason it's bad. The reason is, I wanted to get to this in a second because most Protestants, it's like the threshold is, well, you're married, so why is it a problem? But we can talk about that in a second. It was just going through the prophecies of Paul VI.
And then one of the things he mentioned too was we would see how governments could use it. And in the sense of a population control mindset,
right?
And so when you see these things actually alive today, all of them have happened. They've all come to bear.
Yeah.
So what we see is where the consequence of these acts. So when we start with something that is in itself by its very nature wrong, contraception in itself is never a good.
It's an intrinsic evil.
That's why we call it intrinsically evil. That's right. And so by its very nature, it is intrinsically opposed to that good. No matter how I redefine it, no matter what I attempt to justify it, doesn't change it. And then when I welcome it, when I accept it, then basically, so I'm trying to make something so a couple might say, well, we don't want to have a child at this time. Well, no matter how good, and maybe your reasons might be, but you've now introduced something completely that is not a choice, it's not an object you can choose, and you've introduced it into this moment. Now you've changed that situation. And I think it's important for people to see that this is it's not a nuance, it's not, a semantic game. It's not, sometimes, people look, well, aren't the ends the same? Natural family planning, which is a different subject we can talk about. I don't like talking about natural family planning with contraception because they are two very different things. But people try to combine them. And sadly, some people treat it the same way. But the church does not. The church does not see it that way. And so it's important as we have this kind of conversation with people that we don't allow the narrative to get changed. And that's what I try to do in the mission field, is really to talk about it, because in the mission field, what's happened is because of poverty issues, because of economic issues, this mentality creeps in very easily. And we see governments pushing contraception. We have large organizations and foundations pushing contraception. And in the mission field, people who are struggling because of corrupt governments and corrupt economic policies that have a difficulty raising their families. So contraception seems to be the answer, from either from an oral contraceptive to an injectable or to some type of prophylactic or even sometimes sterilization or IUDs. And the consequences of this are deadly. That's, again, something we can talk about a little later. But that is a very real situation. And what happens is people, again, think that's the answer. But when you, again, peel things back and you find out what's been the consequence of these acts, what has it done to their marital life? What has it done to their physical life? So remember, we're talking about the human person here, a body and a soul, a human person, right? Not two separate entities. And so when we look at this, so that there is a spiritual ramification to choosing something that's contrary, that's evil, that's intrinsically wrong, and also it has a physical consequence as well. And people, don't realize that, from a physical point of view, just looking at it from a physical, the World Health Organization classifies oral contraception as a class 1 carcinogen, right? So people can go look that up and they'll tell you exactly what it is. And so it has a consequence physically as well. And so when we do something that is opposed to the very natural part of especially of a woman's body, she's the one that's ultimately, taking the oral contraceptive or the injectables and so forth, that this is not good for her. It's not good for her spiritually, and it's not good for her physically. And so the church is concerned about the total person, the whole person. And her argument involves both. It always involves both. And that's sometimes that little foot in the door too, when you start really looking at that with people and they realize that, spiritually it's not grounded in Scripture. We talked about it in the very beginning. So if we are Christian people and we say we're biblically grounded, okay, well, here it is. Number 2, if you say that, this is not good for me in my physical health, well, I can show you where that is also present. And then you start breaking that on. I mean, many people have done a great job over the years, of bringing all this to bear. So that's where I try to enter the door with our non-Catholic, community, to get them, because sometimes, all they want to talk about is, science, medicine, that component. And sometimes that's the way in. That's the first foot in the door. The second foot in the door is for those that are really, living their faith. They're very grounded in a biblical tradition, and to be able to talk about that on that level alone is also a foot in the door. And I've seen great success of people really coming to see that and realizing this is not good for me, and I need to walk away from that. And they change their lifestyle, and they change their approach to their marital love, and it strengthens them, and it bonds them and binds them in such a beautiful way. And they come back and they say, thank you, for talking about this, and it's made us stronger. It's made our marriage stronger. It's taught us discipline. It's taught us, to be responsible. Again, something Paul VI talked about in responsible parenthood. And what does that mean? And so the truth really is liberating, but it requires, sacrifice. It requires discipline. It requires, going back to Fulton Sheen, it requires self-control. And, and not to objectify another human being, even one's spouse. Just because one's married does not give one a right to objectify their spouse. So it really is something that if we can get into that conversation, and a person can be patient, and we can be patient with them as they ask questions, and there will be disagreements, and there will be confusion. But if we persevere and they're open, we remain open, we usually find a very good path. And I've seen good things happen as a result. Matter of fact, with all respect, sometimes it's been much easier with our non-Catholic brothers and sisters in our Christian faith than it has been with those who are so-called raised in the Catholic Church.
Unfortunately, that makes a lot of sense. But anyway, I think with that we can kind of close out here, Father. But do you have any final comments maybe for any of our listeners, probably mostly Catholics, but anyone else who's
Sure.
listening just about this issue?
Well, one thing I would do is open up the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's teaching in section on marriage, on the sacrament of marriage, and the teaching of the Church's understanding of marriage in the conjugal act are rich, and they are worth reflecting. I would encourage that for married couples. I would encourage it for couples who are preparing for marriage, to understand what is it and that the Church is so strongly defending. And we've been very calm in our conversation, and we should, but, the Church is passionate about this. This is something she defends very strongly and goes to the wall for. So why would she do that? Why would she just not give in, to the secular mentality? Why would she be mainly the only mainline Christian community church that is standing there fighting against, the push of the secular desire to redefine marriage and redefine, the conjugal act and redefine what we mean by, a fruitful union. There's something here. There's a value, okay? And as I said, we start with the value of the person, made in the image and likeness of God, male and female, he made them, right? Genesis 2. And so when we think about this, all right, and we realize what the church holds, you can understand why she fights. You can understand why she is there. And when people say, well, in the church ought to get her nose out of our bedrooms, no, right? Why? When you read the catechism, you'll understand why. Because, this is a God-given gift, all right? And so it goes back, to something that it's entrusted to us. It's not just to the individual, okay, a husband and wife. It's entrusted to the church, to safeguard and to guide us and to help us to appreciate this good and to stand against those who would go against this, even individuals. So no, there's something for all of us. And I would say the same thing to my brothers, who are in the clergy. Sometimes I encounter misunderstandings there as well. And sometimes, especially in very difficult situations where there's a real compassion for people that are struggling within their marriage, and it could be because of economic issues. And so there could be this tendency, to give way and to kind of give the impression that, well, maybe you shouldn't have any more children. Well, what does that mean? And what should they be employing, quote unquote, to be able to be responsible in that situation? Sometimes there can be some very false guidance. And so the church stands faithful. Paul VI was not the first one to stand, and he won't be the last one to stand. And so today we continue. The second thing I would encourage is, HLI is put together, and I know others have, and I'm going to take advantage of the moment to talk about our education series. It's online. You can come to HLI's website.
I can have these, and I'll just put them up, and you can talk about them, Father.
And this is just a few in the series, but they're online as well on HLI.org. You can come and look them up. And these just give a simple breakdown of what the church teaches. And so we need to educate ourselves, and so that we can be able to articulate, what the church is teaching. But not only for others, but, we could have married couples that maybe are hearing this for the first time. I've encountered that many times over. They've never heard it before. They've been never introduced to what the church teaches, even in their marital preparation courses. No one ever talked about it, and so it could be an opportunity to really grow and to mature. And the last one I would do is I would encourage people to go read and pray with John Paul II's, two of them. Let's go back to Humanae Vitae. If you've never read it, read it, right? And then the second one is Familiaris Consortio. The family in the modern world is an apostolic exhortation by John Paul, now Pope St. John Paul II. It is worth the time, and its beauty of teaching on marriage, on family life, and how this wonderful, beautiful gift of these two institutions of marriage and family really are what really changes our culture. And it's worth the time. So those would be where I would start. And then after that, we can talk about some more.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is HLI's founding subject. Our founder, Father Paul Marx, made his bones on this issue,
right.
In particular, and he said it was the root of all the evils, right, of abortion, anything else. If you want to be pro-life, you really have to be against contraception,
right,
and which is, as we said, for the good of the natural
Exactly.
ends of marriage.
It'll be good for us to pick up some of Father Marx's comments and teaching as we had taught more about this subject, because, as you said, he really is the one that stood his ground, mm-hmm, and brought that message to around the world.
Right, absolutely. So with that, this is not by any means the last word we have to say on that subject, but that's all the time we have for today. So thank you, Father, again, for starting something a little different here with this episode. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to, like we said, find those resources online. I'll hold them up again. It's The Dignity of the Human Person and the Moral Life, and The Introduction to Church Teaching on Contraception. Those are two of HLI's pamphlets on this subject. Is we also have a lot of other stuff on our website and our YouTube channel, etc. So please be sure to subscribe to that YouTube channel, like this video if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please subscribe and continue to watch and listen. Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Keep on living the culture of life. God bless.